A thing happened to me a long time ago with my mother-in-law when she died. She came one evening, well, one Thursday night. I didn't know what it was. The bed was just rumbling about, and things. Still thought it was a cat on the bed. The following night, I saw my mother-in-law sat at the bottom of the bed, and a grey coat, green headscarf, as large as life. And she said things had been moved out of her house and so on and so forth, and she was very upset about it. So I wasn't shocked, I wasn't hurt, upset, frightened or anything, because she wouldn't harm me. I said I would look into it. So I phoned my brother-in-law the day after, asked him what he was doing with Mum's things. Said they'd put them away for safekeeping while they're decorated, plus an ebony box, which she also explained about, and with a dragon on. And I didn't know about this box. Anyway, he said, oh, that was Mum's jewellery box. I said, well, put it back, please, on the chest of drawers where it belongs, and put her ornaments back. So I told him why. He did this for me as a favour. He didn't ask any questions. Sure enough, the night came. Fell to walking, hands feeling round the bed. She came again. She sat down, took her scarf off, and I said, well, things have been put back now, Mum. I said, you'll be all right now. Please leave me alone. I said, because I'm losing a lot of sleep. I said, you can rest in peace. So up she went, turned away, and I said, you forgot your scarf. And she picked a green scarf up, put it back on her head and went. Never seen her again since.
Jean's strange encounter with her dead mother-in-law, for all its extraordinary and eerie qualities, is a remarkably common experience. It's clear from the research records that many thousands of people in different cultures, different parts of the world, have had something similar happen to them. They appear to happen most frequently between members of a family, or people who have a profound emotional connection with the dead person. And they're remembered with immense clarity: the time, the place, the details of dress and movement, and so on. In paranormal circles, they're described as crisis ghosts.
One of the interesting aspects of apparitions is the close relationship between the appearance of many apparitions and the fact that the person whose apparition appears was going through a crisis, either in fact in danger of death or actually dying. And the first set of collections of these was the 1895 one of the Society for Psychic Research. And we're not talking about a set of anecdotes, we're talking about cases that were exhaustively researched, obituaries looked up, witnesses interviewed, newspapers looked at, tombstones, the lot.
Perhaps the single most extraordinary thing about these crisis ghosts is their profound realism. They appear to be so true to life in terms of dress and mannerisms and characteristics and expression of the living personality, so real and solid in fact that those who encounter them immediately respond to them in living terms. They engage them in conversation and so on, right up until the moment that the apparition is revealed for what it is, because it disappears or moves off through a wall.
And usually you find that if there is more than one person present, then in a third of the cases, all of them see the apparition. It looks solid, it looks real, it may act out a very reasonable scenario so that they will, for example, see the door open and Uncle George comes in and they're surprised because the last they heard Uncle George was in Australia and they're in London, and they'll say, George, how did you manage to get here so quickly? And he'll smile. On occasion you might get a word or two, and then, only then, he will do something that a human being couldn't do, like disappear or walk through the walls. And then they begin to get scared. And then, sooner or later, word comes that at that moment Uncle George was drowning off the Great Barrier Reef or something like that. Sadly, because of the 2 world wars, there have been many, many cases like that of a person being shot down in their plane at a time when the family thinks they see him as large as life, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in mufti, walking up the garden path. Oh, John has got unexpected leave. Oh, how wonderful. And they go to the door, they open the door, he's not there. and then they begin to wonder. It's very, very common.
A pilot coming up the garden path long after his death. A story very similar to that occurred not tens of years ago, but as recently as last October, to an airline pilot indeed, as he crossed the foyer of a large modern airport used daily by thousands of travellers. He bumped into a colleague. He still finds it difficult to describe the profound emotional shock of learning that the colleague, with whom he chatted for some time, had in fact died in a very sudden and unexpected way some time previously.
On the way, I slightly deviated from my route instead of going to the bus, and as I deviated, I saw this friend of mine in the door come into the airport. I stopped, turned round, he came straight across to talk to me. I put my bags down, spoke to him fairly briefly. "What are you doing, you old bugger?" or that sort of phrase. Now, this is a guy I've known for 8 or 9 years. We've both flown the routes to the Western Isles, up and down. We meet in the hotel, etc., etc. We had a few words. I noted 1 or 2 things about him. I went to shake hands. He didn't respond, which seemed a bit odd. Puzzled me a bit. He was very thin, he'd lost a lot of weight. Anyway, all of a sudden he said, "I've got to go," and I said, "Fair enough," picked my bags up and legged it for the door to get the bus to the hotel. The following day, I went into town, did a bit of shopping. I went to see a friend of mine in the pub where we normally meet, and he bought me a drink and said, "Hello, how you doing, and what's going on?" and "Not a lot," and all the usual rubbish you talk about. And he said, "Just a minute." And he went round the corner to the paper rack, picked up the Scotsman from the paper rack and came straight back to me, put it on the bar in front of me, saying, "You must know this man. You flew together. You were in the same airline." And to my absolute astonishment, I was stunned, was the obituary of this friend of mine I'd spoken to the day before. And I just couldn't believe it. It wasn't possible. It was not possible.
The captain's case is a typical post-mortem apparition with overtones of unfinished business. There is no doubt about it. We've investigated the case, we've talked to witnesses, and what is important, and is another aspect of this, is that it has made a tremendous difference in the attitude to life of the witness, the captain. Apart from that, there is also seemingly almost the indication that something to do with the man who died incidentally after some short illness and unexpectedly, was trying to make his presence, his continued presence or existence, still felt. And this is absolutely typical.
Now, you can think what you like. If I'm a nut, then you can call me a nut, but I can assure you, as an ex-naval officer, fighter pilot, commercial pilot, I am not, what's the word? I don't make up these silly stories.
That encounter has profoundly changed Bob's attitude to life and indeed to death. He has no doubts whatsoever that he met and chatted to his dead colleague. And that view underlines the powerful scientific relevance of these so-called crisis ghosts. They occur so frequently, and they are so verifiable in the sense that the dates of the death and the encounter can be clearly established. They pose a major challenge to scientific thinking. What is happening? What happens after death if, as seems clear, some aspect, some dimension of the dead person is able to re-establish contact with the living?
there are so many cases that we have to accept that a fraction of people, when they are dying or in danger of dying, somehow contrive that their apparition appears as large as life.
Crisis ghosts are one of the most widespread of paranormal experiences. These appearances of people just before or just after their death to a loved one or to a relative. In Asian cultures, they are very readily accepted as a fact of life, so to speak. In the West, grounded as we are so firmly in centuries of scientific rationalism, they are regarded with the utmost skepticism. People who experience them are embarrassed to talk about them. Scientifically, they scarcely appear above the horizon. There are very few theories that attempt to explain what is happening.
There is a part of the human being that can operate out with time and space. And by that I mean that human beings are not separated one from another as clearly as they seem to be. We have our bodies, we have our personal consciousnesses, we have our personal subconsciousnesses. But I go along with Jung, for example, who said that the deeper he went into a person's psyche, the closer he came to a level where it couldn't be said to belong to that one person alone. And the analogy that one can use is that above the surface of the ocean, the islands are separate. And below the surface of the ocean, the islands are separate. But go deep enough, and you come to a level where all the islands join on the bedrock of the ocean.
If it is possible to generalize in this shadowy area, it seems that the contact is made with a particularly sensitive person, and at times when their minds are in the most relaxed and receptive state. That often occurs in and around the margins of sleep. It leads to a state that is known as lucid dreaming.
And in the dream, I actually saw my father in his coffin, and he was in a funeral parlor in this dream. And I remember going into this funeral parlor with my brother and sister in the dream, and looking. My father's coffin was on like a wooden Charlie horse, you know, the horses, the wooden horse, because it was a brand new funeral parlor. And in the dream, he looked about 2 or 3 stone lighter than I'd remembered him, and his hair had turned snow white, and he was in his coffin. And I remember asking the gentleman who owned the funeral parlor why his eyes weren't closed completely, because you could see part of the blue of his eyes. And they said that he had been in so much pain before he died that they'd teared, and they couldn't close them properly. I also remember in this dream opening my bag and taking out a blue rosary beads and putting them on my father's hands, because my father had been Catholic. Now, I had never put those rosary beads into my bag. The next day, when I woke up the next morning, I got a telegram to say my father had died. When I came back to Britain for his funeral, everything happened as it had in that dream, to the extent that my ex-mother-in-law had actually put that rosary into my bag. And the rosary was a pale blue rosary, and that was the same as the rosary in the dream. And it was exactly as my dream.
Very often in the lucid or very vivid dream that makes such an impression on the person that he remembers it when he wakens up, he will see someone, he will be in contact with that person will talk to them, that person will be anxious, that person might have died even months or years before, or may have died without the person knowing it. And that person will be trying to get information across, unfinished business. And when the person wakens up, they remember the dream. They then perhaps, in a number of cases, actually carry out the plea of the person in the dream, and subsequently find out that the information given in the dream, and which may not be in the minds of any living person, is correct and leads to unfinished business being finished.
Well, when I was about 15 years of age, I was up in London and I was modeling at that time. And I'd been doing a lot of photographic work in the morning for a photographer, and I went back to the hotel to take a rest before the afternoon shoot. And I fell asleep, and I had a really unusual type of sleep. It was as if I was awake, but yet I was asleep. And I saw my grandmother, and I saw her she was coming from the back of a field towards me. And as she came towards me, she started to turn. And as she turned, she grew younger, till she was about 30 years of age. And she said to me in this dream state that I was in, she said, "Patricia, I'm all right. I want you to know that I'm all right. Everything is fine, and that I love you. And I want you to go to my house and look in a certain drawer. There's a key hanging," and she told me where this key was hanging to open this drawer. "And you'll find that I've left something for you." And she said, "I want you to write my book, write my story. It'll be a real success." Now, her name was Maggie. And when I woke up in that room, in the hotel room, the room was just filled with her fragrance. And I knew that she'd passed on. I called my father on the phone, and he said my mother had gone back to Ireland to bury her. And I called Mommy in Ireland and told her to go and get this key, and it was where she'd said in the dream. And she went to this little dresser, and she pulled an envelope, a big envelope out with my name on it. And in it was quite a lot of details about the book that she wanted me to write, and a picture of her mother.
Many of these stories involve actual appearances of people who have died, but there are many more that involve the passing of a message of some sort. The voice is clearly recognized, the sound is quite clear, and the message is remembered in all its detail. This is the sad story of Teddy, close friend of Jane and Sheldon.
I came back from holiday and we're totally exhausted because we've been up for 24 hours, and I came in the house, went straight to bed. But half an hour later, I sat bolt upright in bed, you know, it's like this, and went straight, there was no thought in my head at all. I went right downstairs and I said, "Sheldon, you have to go and get Teddy. There is something wrong. You must go now, immediately." And he got up and he went.
So I went over to Teddy's, and immediately I saw Teddy. He wasn't doing very well, and I said, "Enough of this nonsense. You're going to the hospital." Now, Teddy didn't have a phone, so there was no way of calling an ambulance. So I helped him down the stairs, and he actually lay down on the back seat. And I got in the car and started to drive off, and I tried to drive as fast as I could. At one point along the journey, I turned around and I saw Teddy look up to me, and I saw his eyes roll. His eyes roll into the top, and at that moment I was terribly frightened that Teddy had died.
I could hear all this sort of commotion outside, and it was a commotion. There was car noise, and I could hear Teddy saying, "Sheldon, Sheldon, you've got to let me out of the car, let me out of the car, I've got to get out, you've got to stop." And I got up, with hearing this whole commotion. Went down to Lenny, because I wasn't dressed or anything. Lenny, please go and help Teddy."
I was watching TV at the time, and my mum came in and said, "Help Teddy get out of the car," because she could hear him outside. I went outside to check if he was there, and there was no one there. I couldn't see the car, I couldn't see my dad, and I couldn't see Teddy. I looked around, I went round the corner, and there was no one there. So I came back inside and I told my mum, and she said she could definitely hear voices, and she could definitely hear Teddy's voice in particular. And she said he needed help, and I told her that I thought she was crazy, basically, because I couldn't hear a thing.
And I knew then, that something, that Teddy must have died or something had happened, and I sort of went back to bed and just waiting for a call. It's just, like when you know something like that's happened, it's just sort of everything goes still, and it's just waiting to hear the news.
I sped as fast as I could. Ultimately, I got to the emergency in the hospital, and I rushed out of the car through the doors. I ultimately found a nurse. The whole hospital team came running out to grab Teddy, and they took him into the hospital, and I heard all sorts of electronic things going on. And then I was asked to wait in the waiting room. And I was about to make a phone call when a nurse came over to me, and she said, "Don't use that phone. You'd be more comfortable using this private phone in this room over here." Well, so I did that, and I telephoned Jane, and I said, "I think Teddy's dead." And Jane said, "I know."
when these things happen, you're there with the feeling. You can't you don't start analysing what is it or what does it mean or anything. It's just you're in the feeling, you're in that experience at that moment of time. I think afterwards, when I shot and I got the phone call and he was dead, there was a feeling of terrible shock, because it was quite, it was actually, because you can't really explain this to other people because they think you're a bit weird.
The fact of crisis ghosts would seem to present science with a profound challenge. They are so widespread they can't simply be brushed aside as aberrations of a few misguided individuals. The manifestations or apparitions are described with such clarity and detail, and they have such realism, that they do raise fundamental questions about the nature of death and dissolution. Is there a part of the human being that survives his worldly death? Is there a need, as some scientists would put it, for a whole new science, a science of the mind?
Ghosts which appear to people who have just recently been bereaved, or possibly to other members of the family when they're dying, I'd explain in two ways. Firstly, I'd take a normal scientific explanation. If you look at people who are recently bereaved, most of them have visions of the bereaved person. It's a common function of death. But that doesn't account for everything in the way of crisis apparitions, because sometimes people know nothing about it, don't expect it, and an apparition occurs. I think you have to argue that there may be emotional links, and there's certainly scientific evidence to suggest that emotional states in one brain may be transmitted across distance to another brain where they can be measured. And that would be the sort of basis on which one would then explain crisis apparitions.
I have to say that over the last 100 years, there has been collected a vast amount of evidence in all sorts of aspects of psychic research, which, to anyone open-minded, I would feel, makes it imperative to believe that a human being is not just the big animal that grew the big brain, that there are facets of a human being that can operate outside time and space, and perhaps mortality. The evidence is such that many psychical researchers would say that the question, shall I survive death, is one that can be seriously contemplated by an intelligent person. And as for myself, I would say that if, when I die, I find that I have ceased to exist, I will be very much surprised.